What's up, RotoViz?
Welcome back to the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. I'm Dave Caban from RotoViz. We are back on the RotoViz FF show. Before we get into today's content, I want to give a quick update here, and I'm sorry to those of you that were wondering where we went, why we fell off the face of the earth. The quick and dirty of it before we get into the actual content for this episode is Curtis had some good stuff come up in his personal life. Again, good stuff, nothing bad, that kind of forced him to need to take a step back from producing fantasy content for a while. As a result of that, we had some things that needed to get pushed onto others' plates. I took a decent portion of that, and in addition to making sure that I got all of the different tools and things behind the scene as far as getting the site ready for the season goes, it just made sense that I would take a step back after me and the team talked about it, that I would take a step back from doing the podcasting to make sure that those objectives got achieved. So I had to take a little bit of a break, but I will be back now for the fantasy season. And what we're going to try to do with these pods is achieve 3 objectives that we think are going to be helpful for listeners. So the first is going to be just to create a podcast that you can listen to. Hopefully it's, somewhat entertaining, kind of fun to listen to, and you can learn about making your fantasy teams better. The second objective will be to have a video version of these podcasts that's available so that you can look at the visuals that I'm looking at. You can see how I'm navigating around the site and have that to augment the audio. And then the third piece, which kind of falls right in line with that, is we're hoping that these video versions will allow those of you that are new to the site, or perhaps those of you that have been with us for a while but haven't really looked too much into using the tools, to get a better sense of where information is that you might be interested in, and then how you extract information that is applicable to your teams out of those tools. So we're going to start tonight with a concept that we have talked about many times on the podcast, and we will continue to, and that is weekly GLSP. So what are weekly GLSP? Well, they are game level similarity projections. This is something that I have talked about a lot on various shows, and I've also created a number of articles about. So I'm going to hit a drop here for old time's sake, and then we will break those down. Okay, so weekly GLSP projections. This is the way that we do our projections on a weekly basis. A lot of new users will ask us, where do I go to see your expectations for players in a given week? And the answer to that is we don't do your prototypical process of trying to come up with a player stat line, saying they're going to score 14 points and then publishing that set of expectations. Instead, we do our weekly GLSP process, and it is entirely objective, and it just uses statistics from previous games to project, if you will, expectations for a player in the coming week. Now, they're not really a projection, because what we do, and this is a process I've refined over a number of years, is we do some math behind the scenes that looks at the statistics that tend to carry from week to week and also are predictive of future fantasy scoring. And if you're trying to think to yourself, how many points is, we'll use Jalen Waddle as an example right now, because he's playing as I recording this on a Thursday night. He's playing against the Bills. So you might say, all right, like, what might Jalen Waddle do when they play the Bills tonight? Well, one thing you could do, you could go into our NFL Player Stat Explorer, pull up Jalen Waddle, search through his game logs, and find every instance where Jalen Waddle has played Buffalo and see how he did. Now, that will give you some games, but perhaps you want to have a larger sample, or you're looking at a player that may have changed teams and he's playing against a team that he hasn't played that much. Well, what you could do in a case like that would be look for players like the player you're interested in and find times that that player played a defense like the defense that he's facing. So what we've done with this tool is it goes out and we're doing Jalen Waddle. It's going to find Jalen Waddle. I've done some math to figure out the best way in which it looks backward. What it's going to do is it's going to go back 3 different week ranges. So, it might go back 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. Look at Jalen Waddle's average stat line. Get those stat lines, compile those and aggregate them in a way that's the best for this exercise, to then go off and find other players in previous years that produce similar stat lines. Then it's going to look at the defense that he's facing, do some similar math, and then pull in similar defenses. So it's all driven by this math behind the scenes. But what it's really doing is it's finding players similar to Jalen Waddle historically when they played defenses, in this case, similar to Buffalo. Then you can look at how those players did. And we look at the 50 best matching players based upon the parameters of the offensive player and the defense that he's facing. And then the tool can show you how those players did when they faced off against those defenses. So if we look at Jalen Waddle this week against Buffalo, we're going to see that the average stat line the tool is projecting for him is 8.1 targets, 5.6 receptions, 67 yards, and 30% of his matches scored a touchdown. That's why it's 0.3 here. So of the 50 matches that he had that we're pulling into the tool here, 30% scored a touchdown. Underneath that in the tool, we have a breakdown by scoring type. So in a PPR scenario, Waddle's expected to score 14.4 points. In half, it's 11.6, which makes sense when you look at the receptions, and then 8.8 in a standard league. But where things get really cool when you start using this approach to projecting a player is you can get a sense of where his points are likely to fall if you bucket points into different ranges. So what we do is we look at the percentage of this player's matches that scored less than 5 PPR, scored between 5 to 10 PPR, scored between 10 to 15, 15 to 20, 20 to 25, and then more than 25. And the answer to the question of do you have any other scoring methods in here at present, we only have PPR, although you have the stat line. It's pretty easy to get a sense of the fact that the distributions that you're going to see in the buckets of where a player fall will just kind of shift in line with scoring format, but you're not often going to see many differences between the individual buckets. This would probably make more sense if you're familiar with the tool or you've seen it. So anyways, if we're looking at Jalen Waddle, he has a really interesting distribution this week when you look at the matches that he has and how they fall into the different buckets, because we can see that actually 29% of his matches went between 5 to 10 PPR, just 14% between 10 to 15, but then there's an uptick at 15 to 20 with 24% of his matches going between 15 and 20 points. Now, the other thing that we do is we look at the player's 25th percentile match and their 75th percentile match with some math done in there to kind of remove outliers if need be. And we can see that in PPR, a 25th percentile outcome for players like Waddle against defenses like Buffalo is 8.2 points. A 75th percentile outcome is something that is closer to 19.4 points. Then what's really neat is in the tool, we could call up Jalen Waddle, and maybe you're choosing between somebody like him and Devonta Smith in your lineup. Well, you can pull the two of them up, and then you can compare their distributions. And what's really unique and cool about this is you can look at their distributions, and you can see if one player has significantly more upside in a week than another. Now, in the case of Smith and Waddle this week, what you can see is Waddle does carry a little bit more upside into his matchup than Smith does. And we can see that because at the 20 to 25 point mark, Waddle has 2x what Smith has. 16% of his 50 matches landed in that bucket, whereas you have just 8 for Smith. 8% of Waddle's matches went for more than 25, just 2% of Devonta Smith's. So this tool allows us a pretty neat, objective way to compare players. And we also have it broken out by position for all of the different things that we look at. And you can go in, easily look through a position, but you can also go to our Flex tab and you can compare players across positions. So I could compare, like this week, the example I have of the tool is Jacoby Myers and Najee Harris. So you can look at your flex that way. The other thing that you should know, though, is that this is a completely objective process that is built entirely upon historical information that's available. The ramification of that is, for example, if you're looking at Devonta Chan, and I know when you listen to this game will have already happened, the tool's not going to know that Raheem Mostert isn't playing in this game. If you're looking at a quarterback who's missing one of his wide receivers, it's not going to know that that player isn't there, which you could say is a pitfall of this process. But the one thing that I would counter with is because it's giving you this range of outcomes, some of those players that pull into that match likely had similar scenarios. And you can use this to get a sense of, all right, well, when these players didn't hit their average PPR and they fell below that 50th percentile match, what did those performances look like and how many did we see? So that's not going to be a perfect science there, but maybe it gives you a little bit more information than just a straight up projection. Whereas if we were going through, or you were going through the process of saying, what are the ramifications on this team of Raheem Mostert not playing? If you come up with something that's entirely wrong, you might be missing some of those other cases that you could see, whereas the GLSP will kind of make you think about it. Now, this is very similar, to be honest, to the process that we do for the range of outcomes tool, which is looking at the season. So long and the short of it is here, if you're interested in getting weekly projections on the site, Weekly GLSP is the place to go. It adds more context. It's a little bit different than your objective projection, maybe not quite as malleable to some of the injury or team level context that you could see, but we have found it to be very useful. And the final thing that I'll mention too is because you get this average stat line created, a lot of our users like to look at it to get a baseline of what a player is going to do in a given week. Now, that could be for a fantasy purpose. It could be for some type of betting purpose or any type of game out there that's driven off of over-unders or trying to know how many touchdowns a certain player is going to score. All right, so I'm going to try to keep these episodes to 20, 25 minutes each week. Now that we've got that context we're going to need as we go forward through the season out of the way, let's take a look now at some of these positions and interesting players within them. And I think that I'd like to start now by just looking for some upside at running back. And here, let's go into our list now of running backs for this week. And let's look at our 75th percentile PPR amount for a lot of players here. And we're going to see who's the first interesting name that comes up. Well, the 75th percentile projection for Joe Mixon is actually the highest of the week, coming off a great week one. He's facing Chicago. Breece Hall's behind him, Isaiah Pacheco, Josh Jacobs, Devonta Chan, Kyron Williams. Then the interesting one here is Ramondre Stevenson against Seattle. Now, he's coming off a terrific week. Let's go drill into Stevenson and get a better sense of what we might be able to expect for him against the Seahawks. So he was heavily utilized last week. His average stat line, based upon this week's GLSP, has him at 16 rushes, 73 yards, 60% of his matches scored a rushing touchdown. They also averaged 3 targets, 2.2 receptions, and 13 receiving yards. This gives him an average PPR of 14.4. He does get 14% of his matches above 25 PPR, 6% between 20 to 25, and then 24% went beyond 15. So in total, 44% of his matches going from more than 15 points. If we continue our way down this list, another name that pops out here that's pretty interesting is Tony Pollard, based upon a 75th percentile projection that lands him with 18 PPR. Now, he is in a new situation this year in comparison to some of the games informing his projection. And if we go into the NFL Stat Explorer here, we can take a quick look at some of his games from last year and just kind of reacquaint ourselves with what he did in 2023 as a member of the Cowboys in that one game that we saw from him this season. You have to forgive me here. My computer's kind of lagging with my recording software. So we know that Pollard did have a good game last week. We'll come back to that in a second. But first, let's just drill down here on Pollard. And his projected stat line puts him at 15 carries. He is facing the New York Jets this weekend, 70 yards. 40% of his matches scored a touchdown. 3.4 targets were the average, 2.5 receptions, and 15 rushing yards. He has a pretty flat concentration if you look at his bucket distribution between those point thresholds we talked about, with 27% between 5 to 10, 24% between 10 to 15, 24% between 15 to 20, and 16% going between 20 and 25. Okay. All right. We got this pulled up, so now we can look up Tony Pollard. And Tony Pollard in Dallas last year, if we take a quick look at his game log in the NFL Player Stat Explorer, was many times in the back half of the year between 15 to 20, probably average just from eyeballing at about 15 carries a game. In the one game against Chicago in week 1 for him on the Titans, he did see 16 rushing attempts, also saw 4 targets. So that average stat line, at least based upon what we saw in week 1, it does seem to be fair for him on Tennessee. Now, of course, the efficiency could be different, but these are our expectations for Pollard. So the other fun thing that we can do is we can look at Tony Pollard here and Tyjae Spears, because I'm sure that many listeners out there are going to be thinking, what can I do with Spears this week? Is he usable? Well, we see that things are very slanted in the favor of Pollard from a point scoring perspective. And if we look at Spears' average stat line, he's projected to just see 6 attempts, 30 yards, 2.7 targets. So the tool does really not love him. You could argue that some of the games in here were with him in a very different context, but I actually think this is kind of fair here. So let's go back and look at some more of the running backs this week. I'm going to sort this on our average PPR, and I'm just going to call out some names that I think people will be interested in. J.K. Dobbins with an average of 13. Tool has him as the RB15 on the week based on average PPR. Many of the other players that we see in here are familiar faces. It has James Cook at 14.2. We'll see where he actually ends up. It looks like he could outscore that given what I saw of the game. Jerome Ford, probably another interesting name for listeners. He comes out with an average of 12.6 PPR. And if we drill into how the tool is arriving at that, we can see that he's scheduled or estimated based upon his average, the average of his comparable players, to have 12 rushing attempts, 54 rushing yards, 40% of his matches scored rushing touchdowns. They also saw, or his comps, the average was 4.2 targets, 3.1 receptions, 21 receiving yards. Does not have too much upside. Only 24% of his matches went beyond 15, but he's heavily concentrated with actually 72% between 5 to 15 PPR, with 41% of his matches going between 10 and 15 PPR. As we continue down the list, it does not love Derrick Henry against Las Vegas. this weekend. Travis Etienne, who's facing Cleveland, also doesn't score as well as his managers might like. Brian Robinson Jr., who, if we quickly pull up his game log here from the Commanders' first game with Jaden Daniels, he had a pretty good week, and in a game in which he saw 12 rushing attempts and 4 targets, ended up finishing as the RB14 on the week with PPR score of 17.9. Now, it helps that he got a rushing touchdown, but he also converted 3 receptions into 49 yards. So the tool has him as the RB, looks like around RB21 this week. And if we take a look at his average stat line, it would be 12 rushing attempts, 46 yards, 20% of his matches scored touchdowns. They also added 24 receiving yards on 3.3 receptions. He's most heavily concentrated between 5 to 10 PPR, but we do see a decent chunk of his matches going between 10 and 20 with 36% actually. So as far as this week goes, he looks like a pretty decent option at running back for some managers out there. I'm going to take a quick sweep through here and see if there's any players that are very interesting. Kenneth Walker comes in as the RB32, and that is on top of the injury concern that we have for him this week. Interestingly, Zach Charbonnet is only about 8 slots behind him. So this one's really interesting. The Seahawks are facing New England. If Walker doesn't go, you would think that Charbonnet gets to consolidate some more of the work. Given, though, that things were a little skeptical about Walker on his own, I think that you're probably going to be able to start Charbonnet if you need. However, though, if he's more of a flex option on your team, you're probably going to want to pop into the tool and look at him in comparison to some other players because this matchup clearly does not seem to work out very well for these Seahawks backs against defenses like New England. So we have a couple minutes left here. I'm going to take a quick look through wide receiver and let you know about some of the names that pop out that you might not expect. And really, the first 15 wide receivers this week are all names that you might expect. Very, very chalky this week, actually, which is kind of interesting. So I have to get to wide receivers 31 to 45 before we see a name that I think is interesting enough to discuss. We have 2 rookie wide receivers scoring on the top. Actually, Malik Neighbors just misses, but in the top 36, we have Ladd McConkey and Brian Thomas Jr. Now, McConkey is facing off against the Panthers. Brian Thomas Jr. is playing the Browns. Let me give you a quick idea. Now, this is a very limited sample here, but given that one game we saw from McConkey against the Panthers, he would be expected to see 6.3 targets, put up 4 receptions, 51 yards, and actually 30% of his matches scored touchdowns. However, though, 39% of his matches landing between 5 to 10 points, which I think that feels pretty reasonable of an expectation. If we look at Brian Thomas Jr. Against the Browns, we'd expect him to see around 5.9 targets, 3.8 receptions, 47 yards, and 40% of his matches scored touchdowns. And we also see a pretty high number, or a pretty large concentration between 5 to 10 points, with 36% of his matches landing in there. If I continue to look through the list here, any other players that are jumping out, Jacoby Myers, a decent outlook at wide receiver 37. Alec Pierce comes in with around 10.4 PPR. Cortland Sutton at 9.8. Garrett Wilson does not have a great matchup against Tennessee this weekend, given our GLSP. However, I think that you'd have to make an exception here to his GLSP, given the bump up at quarterback play that we're going to see for him. Alan Lazard, 8.7. You could also make the same case for him. Kind of boost him up a little bit. And at tight end, we'll take one quick look here. Evan Engram coming off a very, very rough week. Still, GLSP, despite that, and more so recent games get weighted in more heavily than the games that get pulled in that are not as recent, and he still projects as the tight end 1 in this process. Chigga Kwankwo, comes in at the tight end 7, so it does really like his outlook against the Jets. Tucker Kraft, another name that pops here, of course, without Jordan Love. You're going to have to take that with a grain of salt. Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts rounding out the group of tight end 1s. Juwan Johnson scores nicely against the Cowboys this week. Of course, he's coming off a game in which the Saints really stuck it to the Panthers. He found the end zone. That's one of the things likely helping him in his outlook against Dallas. If we look at Johnson, we'll see that his average stat line based upon his comps would put him with around 4.6 targets, 3 receptions, 34 yards. 30% of his matches scored touchdowns. So this is the typical tight end play. You're just looking for the player, or we see players scoring well at the position just based upon the ability to get into the end zone once you get outside of that elite tier. So that is how GLSP functions. This is some of the ways that I look at the tool, how I kind of think about things when I'm looking through it, and how you can hopefully use it to not only have a good week 2, but also make your decisions across the season. We will definitely be talking about this more, and we'll also be taking a further look at some of the tools. And next time we do this process, we won't have to have all of that build up front explaining how to use it. So hopefully you learned something here, and hopefully you enjoyed your time, and I will see you next time. Thank you for listening to the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. Send us questions at rvffshow@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at Dave Caban FF and at CPatrickNFL. Leave us a voicemail at 978-615-9214, and make sure to rate, review, and subscribe.